In June 1919, world leaders gathered inside the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. Exactly 5 years earlier, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand had set the world on fire. After 4 years of unprecedented slaughter and the collapse of entire empires, the victors were ready to dictate peace terms for a war to end all wars. 2 German delegates stepped forward into a silent, tense hall. They were not there to negotiate or debate. They were there solely to sign an ultimatum. Refusal meant an immediate resumption of the war and the complete military invasion of a country already facing starvation. To the German people across all political spectrums, this was a diktat, a dictated peace and national humiliation that an entire generation vowed never to forget or forgive. The first layer of this peace involved a systematic carving away of German territory, dismantling the borders of a nation that had been a global industrial titan. The treaty stripped Germany of 13% of its land and 10% of its population. On this map, Alsace in Lorraine returned to France. In the east, the Polish corridor physically severed East Prussia from the German homeland. Along with the land went vital industrial infrastructure. This shift cost Germany 75% of its iron ore reserves and 26% of its coal production, while every overseas colony was confiscated and distributed among the Allied empires. The military restrictions struck at the spine of the state. The army was capped, conscription was permanently outlawed, and no heavy artillery, combat aircraft, or submarines were allowed. These restrictions left the nation feeling defenseless and surrounded by heavily armed neighbors, a condition that struck directly at the heart of German national identity. Article 231, universally known and despised as the War Guilt Clause, stands as the most enduring source of outrage in the entire document. This clause forced Germany to officially accept sole legal responsibility for all loss and damage caused by the war. To the German public, this ignored the complex diplomatic failures and secret alliances involving Russia, France, and Britain that had triggered the conflict. By establishing this moral blame, the Allies justified a staggering financial demand, 132 billion gold marks, to fund their own reconstruction and debt payments. Economist John Maynard Keynes resigned from the British delegation in protest, calling the terms mathematically impossible. He warned that pushing the German population into poverty would lead to political extremism. This warning manifested in the hyperinflation crisis of 1923. By November, a single loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Families carried wheelbarrows of paper cash just to buy basic daily supplies. The middle class was financially wiped out. The psychological scar was permanent, forever linking the Democratic Republic and the Versailles Treaty to poverty, ruin, and chaos. Beyond the economic and physical loss, a psychological myth took root that allowed the public to reject the reality of their defeat. When the armistice was signed in 1918, German soldiers were still standing on foreign soil and the border had never been crossed. For millions, the sudden surrender came as a total shock. Military leaders, including Paul von Hindenburg, deflected blame for their own strategic collapse by spreading a narrative of domestic betrayal. This was the stab in the back myth. It claimed the undefeated army on the front lines had been betrayed at home by politicians, revolutionaries, and minorities. The politicians who signed the treaty were branded November criminals, convincing millions that Versailles was the illegitimate product of treason rather than military failure. This myth turned the misery of the treaty into potent fuel for radical nationalist movements, as citizens looked to blame someone for their humiliation. The Great Depression of 1929 shattered Germany's fragile economic stability, throwing millions into unemployment. With faith in democratic institutions evaporating, radical movements found fertile ground in the collective resentment that had simmered for a decade. Adolf Hitler built his political rise on this foundation of anger, turning the existing hatred for the Versailles Treaty into a central tool of National Socialist propaganda. His campaign focused on a singular, irresistible call to action: the destruction of the Versailles Treaty, the rebuilding of the military, and the restoration of national pride. To a population battered by poverty and the stigma of the War Guilt Clause, the promise to avenge the diktat radicalized millions and drove the nation toward a new conflict. By imposing punitive demands without the military will or permanent unity to enforce them, The Allied powers created the exact conditions for a second, more destructive confrontation 20 years later.